Welcome to The Forest Garden, a podcast for gardeners who want to upgrade their landscapes into biodiverse food forest systems. On today's episode of The Forest Garden, we are venturing out into the field to hunt for some wild edibles. It's foraging season. Spring is in full swing, and I'm sure each of you have had your social media feeds filled with images of foraging baskets, just packed to the brim with ramps and morels. Maybe you've even posted a photo like that yourself. On today's episode, I'll be sharing some thoughts on foraging, providing some basic tips and tricks for beginners, and posing some ethical questions about certain popularly foraged wild foods. Stick with us. Hey there, everyone. Just a note to start us off. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to. Ben recently moved to the Sacramento area of California, where he has a totally cool job reforesting the landscape with a diverse selection of tree species. Seriously, I'm really jealous that he got this job. I'm a little bit mad about it. And I am in the middle of finals week in my grad program at UMass Amherst. So today's episode will be a little bit different than our normal format. I have a long form spiel about foraging for your listening ears. But before we get into that, Ben has a live from the field report for us, all the way from the West Coast, sunny California. Let's listen.
Hey everyone, I wanted to talk about a fruit tree that I stumbled upon pretty quickly as I moved to the Sacramento area. We're in hardiness zone 9 here, but this is a tree that could grow in even colder climates than we have here. And the tree that I wanted to talk about is the loquat tree. I'm actually standing in front of the first loquat tree that I saw in my neighborhood, and it's pretty large. I'd say it's maybe 20 feet, and I've seen some ones that are much larger, probably closer to 40 feet tall. And it's an evergreen, so it keeps its leaves. It has these sort of really fleshy, thick leaves, and it's kind of a beautiful tree, actually. And then right now it's in kind of the end of the season. It started in, probably early to mid-March, and now we're approaching the end of April. The tree still has plenty of fruit on it, so it's got a long season. And so I've been foraging loquats around my neighborhood for the past month or so, and I think they're really good. It's a tree that I don't really hear too much about, and a fruit that I don't really hear too much about, but I love them. I just picked one off the tree right here. They kind of look like Nerf balls from the 90s, from my memory at least of what Nerf balls are. They're the color of like a yellow Asian pear, like a golden Asian pear. They're actually related to apples and pears in the Rosaceae family, so that makes sense. But they have a pretty large seed in the center, almost like a lychee or lychee. I'm gonna take a bite here. Yeah, really, really juicy. This is the end of the season, so they're very ripe too. Earlier they had more of a sour note to them. But I really love loquats. They produce heavily, and they don't get any disease that I know of, at least not in this area, at least not these trees. Every fruit that I pick is really good quality. There's no bug damage or disease on the leaves or on the fruit. They don't seem like they ripen once you pick them, which is probably a reason why you don't see them in the stores too often. But definitely worth growing, and they can survive down to temperatures of 10 Fahrenheit. But temperatures of anything below freezing can kill the flowers on it. So you'll have to look into your particular climate to see if loquat is worth growing. You know, if you want it just for the evergreen leaves, that's cool, but you probably want it for the flowers and the fruit too. But definitely look into it. There's plenty of varieties, and if you're in a warm climate, for sure you can grow it. And if you're in anything colder than 8 or 9, you might want to look into whether or not it will work for your site.
Thank you, Ben, for that awesome in-the-field reporting from the sunny shores of California. I'm familiar with a few different places that experimented with using loquats in insulated greenhouse systems where, it wasn't a heated greenhouse, it was unheated, but the greenhouse would never drop below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, or even get close to that, if I remember correctly. So yeah, definitely something to check out, even if you're on the East Coast. Loquats sound delicious. I've never gotten to try one before, but definitely something to look into, even if you're in zone 5, zone 6, and have a greenhouse set up or some sort of 3-season room that will keep those trees alive year round. Definitely a really cool edible to forage for if you're not in Zone 5 or Zone 6. Really exciting stuff. So what I'm going to be talking about today is more of the East Coast experience. As already mentioned, Ben is now on the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. So this podcast is going to change just a little bit, but not too crazily. Probably be pretty much the same. But today I am recording from also in the field where I just have been foraging all day, basically. I've been just popping around, checking out some spots that I previously have been to and thought, this might be a good place to revisit. So this episode will kind of be a mishmash between tips and tricks about foraging if you've never foraged before, and also some advice or just some thoughts and notes on foraging in general on in the East Coast in the United States when it comes to native plants and invasive plants and how foraging sort of fits in that sphere. So please stay tuned, and I guess we'll just jump right into it. Now, as I record this, I'm in Western Massachusetts, where I just got back from a little foraging expedition at a location adjacent to an established forest garden where there's quite a few ramp patches. I just have a few thoughts to share about the topic of spring foraging. I know that everybody has their own relationship with spring foraging. I'm sure many of you listeners have foraged for a number of wild edibles in the past. First, when we talk about ramps, I want to just cover a few things, maybe some hot takes, I guess. They're tasty. I like it. I like the flavor of ramps. Alliums are good for you. Wild leeks, I'm sure that they're quite nutritious. But I feel like often foragers sort of think of springtime foraging as ramps and morels. Morels being mushrooms. In the East Coast, this time of year, I just hear ramps, this, that, everything ramps. I can't say I'm super well informed about every detail behind population decline in ramps on the East Coast, but from what I understand, the sort of uptake in interests amongst people like us who are into foraging and really into the outdoors, hiking, and I mean, it's sort of like a treasure hunt, foraging is going out and finding wild food to bring home and prepare. Maybe you'll make some ramp pesto or something similar, but there's a negative side to it. If you go out and you want to forage for ramps, I guess one of the biggest issues is you just show up and you see a ramp patch. You don't really understand what the life cycle of that patch has been over the past decade or 5 years even. If it's in decline already when you get there could be, potentially dozens to hundreds of ramps that you could harvest from. But the question is, should you be harvesting them at all? That's the question I just posed to myself when I was out there in the sort of adjacent forest garden wild food area. There was probably a couple hundred, maybe 400 ramps in front of me. And I'm thinking, do I really need to cut some leaves and bring leaves home? Is this something I actually need to be doing right now? I've already found them. It was the act of finding them was really cool. And I just had this moment of reflection of like, these ramps, I don't know anything about them. I don't know what they've been doing before I got here. And maybe it's better if I don't rip off a single leaf whatsoever or cut a single leaf. About the pulling, you never really want to pull ramps, period. You shouldn't pull bulbs. Just before arriving at this foraging location, I was at a supermarket where they were selling wild ramps with the bulbs and leaves and even roots still attached. So it's so ironic, but for about $2 I bought a dozen ramps that I then wrapped in a paper towel, and I'm going to attempt to transplant them. They don't really like being transplanted. They don't transplant very well, but I sort of wanted to know who's supplying this little country farm store with these ramps that are not big bulbs by any means. And my attitude was just sort of like, these probably shouldn't be here. Very weird. And then so I had that feeling, and then I go and I find this giant wild ramp patch and decide, actually, I'm not gonna take any of these. And so, I mean, obviously, this ramps are not the entire face of foraging in the spring. I know, and especially this is all very specific to the East Coast, where I am in New England. Fiddlehead's very popular right now. Ostrich fern is what you want to be looking for if you're not familiar. You don't want to be harvesting fiddleheads from certain other ferns because they just won't be processed in your body the same way that ostrich fern fiddleheads are. So that's one thing, is that if you're interested in foraging and you never have done any spring foraging before, be sure to do your research and get some plant ID books or little field guides. There's also apps, but often the apps aren't as accurate as you might think they are. And so another really, really popular forageable food that people look out for this time of year is morels. Personally, I've never actually found a morel in the wild. I coincidentally have had last year several morels that just popped up in my sunchoke bed that I don't know how they got there. I took some soil from a pile next to my house that was dumped previously by my a different family member, in just sort of a wet area, and I guess at some point it got inoculated by some spores of morels, which is really wild. So, most people will spend hours going out foraging for morels and not have any luck, which I have done on a number of occasions. And then it's just, it's very ironic that it was growing right in my own backyard. But the way to identify a morel is when you cut the morel at the base, the whole thing should be hollow. If it's not hollow, then you have a false morel on your hands, which is not something you want to mess with. And this is true for most mushroom species, is that there's almost always a lookalike. Some have more lookalikes than others. So you really kind of have to know your shit. You have to be on top of your identification, bring a field guide, go with a friend who's done this before. If you have a friend or an acquaintance, or there's even meetup groups, the meetup.com or other websites to go on spring foraging walks. And some people have just been doing this a long time and it can just instantly recognize, oh, that's a false morel, or this is turkey tail and this is false turkey tail. And the more you do it, the more you'll kind of, that'll be you someday potentially. But in the beginning, just, it really helps to have someone to kind of hold your hand through the foraging experience. It also makes it more fun. It makes it a social thing. If you've never gone foraging before, it kind of feels like fishing for the first time, sort of. You don't really. There's plenty of times you can go fishing and you don't catch anything, or you could go fishing. You could go fishing 100 times and not catch a fish. If you go 100 times, it's pretty likely, I guess, you're going to catch one. And same thing for foraging for wild edibles. And then there's this other topic when it comes to spring foraging, and I'm really more of a proponent for this side of foraging, which is that there's tons of invasive species all over the place, at least where I live, that are just as tasty, sometimes even more tasty than the native wild edibles. So ramps are a native, and now becoming maybe a threatened species, or the ramps are in decline, which is not good. We shouldn't, all of us hipsters and people who are into wild foods, are we responsible for this? That's not good. So maybe it's time to turn our attention to some other forageable wild edibles out there that are not in decline. They are, considered weeds or noxious weeds by lots of states, which generally, the term weed just usually means a plant that you don't know, but the noxious weed list is the states and different or countries even have labeled certain weeds as so detrimental to agriculture, or just detrimental to society almost, that they, you can't plant. It's illegal to plant them. You can't. There's a reason why they don't sell them at nurseries. So one of these plants that is, I don't know if it's on the noxious weed list, and also the list. These lists vary by state and in different regions. But garlic mustard is a delicious wild edible. It is a quote unquote invasive plant, which, whole different topic, but everyone should evaluate their relationship to that word invasive in the first place, because all plants were invasive at some point. But garlic mustard, I harvested a bunch 2 days ago, and I brought some. I was visiting my family, and what did we have? We had some bison burgers, and on the side, it was like a broccoli rabe. Basically, what you want to do is you want to find the garlic mustard. You can eat the leaves, you can eat the young stalks. I prefer the young stalks because right before they're about to flower, they have this little broccolini head. And it's just like going to the store and buying broccoli rabe. Broccoli rabe can be a little bit bitter, and the Garlic mustard is also a little bit bitter, but if you cook it up with some oil, we threw in some mushrooms that we're growing in the backyard as well. Some wine cap mushrooms. They were very tasty, and the flavors got all blended together, and the bitterness was kind of overwhelmed by some of the other, the garlic that we chopped up and put in it, and some onions and some homegrown perennial leeks, and mixed together, and the bitterness wasn't so powerful. But just this idea of going out and foraging for wild edibles that are invasives, you're not harming the landscape at all. People, on paper, these plants are invaders, which is a loaded concept, in my opinion. But there's others, but more than just garlic mustard. So there's garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is very tasty. Try to get it before it flowers. If it's flowered, then you're not going to get the sort of broccoli rabe stalk. You just harvest the leaves, which are also good. Make sure that you cook it. You don't eat it raw. It has some compounds that your body will not like processing, and if you don't cook it, stir fry it, whatever. Moving on from there, though, there's dozens of other wild species that you can go out and look for in public parks or in your neighborhood. The Aurelias are definitely one of these. They're a really thorny species of, well, actually, I was going to say invasive plants. I don't know if they're technically on the invasive lists or not, but they've often been propagated by different nurseries or planted in public places as ornamentals, and then they flew the coop. They got out of the garden or got out of the intentional planting and colonized certain areas that they were never intended to be planted in. And lots of these plants spread by underground rhizome, or they seed prolifically, and this is often the characteristics of plants that become quote-unquote invasive, because they're just really good at making copies of themselves and really good at spreading their seed by the wind far and wide. So Aurelia alata is the most common, most popular of this sort of plant family that I'm aware of the genus. It's also called Japanese Angelica tree. And you can find it at some nurseries, but it's a woody plant, and you'd think, why am I going spring foraging if it's a woody shrub? It likes, and I'll explain in a second. It likes to grow in moist, kind of wet-ish areas. Often it's also found in slopey areas, but you'll find it in a thicket because it creates this colony in a big thickets of these very, very thorny plants, and it's from East Asia. It's very tasty, though. It's of the forageable species. It's really, really a popular foraged food in Japan. And what you forage this time of year in April is the young shoots that come out of the woody parts of the plant. So let's say that there's a shrub that's like 4 feet high. There's at the tips of all these different stalks, of the woody stalks, will be new green growth that could be 3 inches to up to 6 or 8 inches that you can chop off, and then you bring them home and make tempura, or you can blanch them and use them in salads. They're just, the young shoots are what you eat. The Japanese name is taranoki, and the shoots are known as taranomi, which I'm probably doing a terrible job of pronouncing. Please excuse me there. I do not speak Japanese. So this is another sort of I hate the term invasive, but it's not a plant that you have to worry about threatening or endangering or putting its populations in decline, because it's not native to where we live in the United States. I understand that some of you who are listening might not be in the United States at all. I'm sorry. This is obviously going to be different for you if you don't live in America. But rather than going out and looking for these really popular allium wild leeks that you could potentially be harming them by harvesting any, when you could just be growing chives at home or perennial leeks at home that aren't threatened or endangered. Well, it just, why not go out and harvest some equally tasty young shoots of something that you're not going to be messing with the population whatsoever, which is a good thing. You can feel good about harvesting it, I guess, which is what it comes down to. One thing to think about when harvesting any wild foods is that you shouldn't be taking more than you need or more than you're able to process pretty much immediately when you get home. So if you're going to go out and harvest a bunch of fiddleheads and not immediately eat them or pickle them or do something with them, they're probably not going to last very long. They might spoil faster than you are able to do anything with them. And that just really sucks to be the person who goes out and gets all this, like, gets so excited, like, oh, look at all these, fiddleheads that I can bring home and eat, and then you don't really end up doing anything with them, and you have to throw them away or compost them. That kind of sucks, because what have you done? What have you contributed to the plant's natural environment by doing that, and how has it benefited yourself? It's just a waste. That's the complete opposite of everything that we're about here as people who are interested in foraging or interested in wild food and interested in ecology and forest gardens, etc. So really, going out and foraging is one thing, but coming home and processing what you've gone out and foraged for is something entirely different. And I'm guilty of having been this person on occasion but it's usually something like dandelions. So, you'll see hundreds of dandelions in a field where that it hasn't been sprayed or whatever, and then, I could make dandelion jelly, and then you end up taking way too many dandelions to process or do anything with, and the jelly never gets made. That happens, but you just have to be aware that that can happen. And with that in mind, don't harvest 600 dandelions with your significant other or your parents or friends or whatever. And you want to know what you're going to make with what you're foraging. Don't just go out and say, I know that's a forageable item, and I've never had it, I've never tried it, but maybe I'll do something with it, so I should bring it home. You want to be committed, and you want to have the time set aside to actually process your foods into something that is tasty. And the coolest part about foraging is you get to eat the fruits of your labor, which isn't always, that's not something that's easily replicable in other hobbies to have, I guess, other than gardening or forest gardening, whatever. But the act of going out and doing any sort of let's find it in the wild and then being able to actually eat it at the end, that's just an awesome feeling. Another sort of unusual, wild, tasty treat that you might want to look out for, not necessarily just yet, this will come in a few weeks or more maybe a month from now, is actually tree leaves. That might be a weird concept to wrap your head around, but there are several different species of trees that have edible leaves, and some of them actually, there's a difference between edible and actually tasty, or edible and eatable. There's lots of edible things out there that when you try foraging for it or eating it, don't actually taste that good. They're listed as being edible on lots of databases like Ken Fern's Plants for Your Future, PFAF. And there's a rating system on there where it says 1 star for edibility, and then you go out and you try it, like Mahonia, for example, and you're like, ooh, that's not actually that good. Maybe there's an improved cultivar somewhere, or maybe there isn't. I don't know. But I'm sure some of you listening might love Mahonia, but I'm not a huge fan. Yeah, so that goes for tree leaves too. Eating tree leaves, kind of a far out concept at first, but over time it'll grow on you. And the thing that I'm going to recommend that you do is you start with 2 trees that have very edible, somewhat tasty leaves, depending on the cultivar or depending on the random seedling. And the first that I'm going to recommend is mulberry. I have a mulberry tree that grows in my front yard, and it is a weeping mulberry that also bears fruit. It's Morels alba pendula, and the fruits are delicious, but the young leaves are also delicious. They have a nice nutty flavor. I've eaten them raw. You're not really supposed to eat them raw. You're supposed to cook them. I'm still alive. I didn't die, but I wouldn't recommend eating them raw in large quantities, or maybe anything more than just, a nibble to see what it tastes like. I will say I've also tried dozens of mulberry tree leaves that didn't taste good. So it really is species and cultivar dependent. There's mulberries all over the place, and nothing stopping you from plucking a young leaf, which really is when they're young, it's not like a leaf at all. It's almost like a salad green. You'll be really amazed at how edible they are, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not. If you find a good one, maybe set a little marker in your phone or on your computer of where that tree is. And they put out so much food. Mulberries just put out so much food throughout the season. Certain cultivars will have the actual mulberries on there for 2 months or longer straight, 2 or 3 months. Sometimes I think 4 for certain cultivars, which is just unheard of. And the leaves too. I mean, the leaves obviously are on there all season long, and I'll be eating tree leaves in July from the mulberry tree in the front of my house, and they're still delicious. It's wild. There's other mulberry trees out there that perhaps listen to this podcast, go out and, mulberry leaves, and try one and just spit it out because it will not taste good. And that will happen. It really is dependent on the variety, which I don't, some of them, I guess over time by accident or maybe on purpose, somebody selected for edibility of tree leaves, but I'm no expert. All I know is that the one I have tastes pretty darn good. And then, so the next thing is lindens. Tilia, the tall giant lindens, and then little leaf linden, 2 different species of linden, both have edible leaves. Equally as tasty to mulberry. Same deal, that some are better than others. And yeah, you want to get like the young spring leaves versus, in your head, you might be imagining like in October, like eating one of these leaves just before they fall off the tree. That's not what I'm recommending. There's a reason why, this is a spring foraging episode, and this is kind of like a later spring endeavor of tree leaves to munch on. But give it a shot. Yeah, it's you might be surprised. You're not going to be, doing any harm to the natural environment by plucking a few leaves off a mulberry tree. They grow like weeds. They grow everywhere and pop up prolifically. You might not even recognize you have a mulberry tree in your backyard until you become familiar with what the leaves look like, and then you'll be like, oh wow, I have 4 of them, and they're all really little, and I could transplant them, or I could graft on a different variety that is more of an improved cultivar. So give it a shot. The tree leaf foraging is something that really isn't popular or talked about nearly as much as some of the other wild edibles out there. As a society, nobody has told us to eat tree leaves in the United States or in Western culture, which we probably should start doing more. Eric Tonesmeyer has some interesting research on mulberry leaves and other tree leaves to check out. I think that he published in the scientific journal PLOS One, PLOSONE, I'm pretty sure. But if not, just give it a Google. One of the other journals out there. And I don't know. You might be surprised. I will say that I was certainly surprised with how good the mulberry leaf tasted that I tried for the very first time. I was expecting it to be something I spit out, but I did not. I went back for seconds. So yeah. I hope I didn't bore you with these thoughts and notes on foraging. It's that time of year. I mean, it's the Hungry Gap, or we're coming out of the Hungry Gap. And there's perennial vegetables popping up in my forest garden. And when that happens, when I start to see some of the early risers popping out, I'm like, oh, it's foraging season. Time to go out and see if there's any wine caps in the forest or any other cool wild edibles. We just have to be pretty mindful when we're doing this is just the kind of note for today. I hope that you all have an awesome time going out into your native woodlands and exploring, and I hope you make some tasty treats with what you find. So yeah, thanks for tuning in, listeners, and see you next time.